Nobody told me the Veth'raan delegation would find me funny. To be fair, nobody told me much of anything. My assignment packet arrived 6 days before the Conclave of Aleth-Sora, and it said in its entirety, report to the Cultural Liaison Office, assist Senior Attaché Delphine Mbeki dress appropriately. That last point was underlined. I was 22 years old, 11 weeks out of the university exchange program, and I owned exactly one blazer. I pressed it the night before and took the early transport to the orbital platform. And I showed up on time, which is more than I can say for 3 of our 40 senior diplomats. Senior Attaché Mbeki met me at the airlock, with the expression of someone who had just been handed one more thing to manage. She looked at my blazer, she looked at my notepad, paper, because the embassy's tablet allocation had run dry 2 postings ago, and I'd learned to work with what I had. She said, "You take shorthand?" I told her I did. She handed me a stack of background files and walked away. That was the orientation. The Conclave of Aleth-Sora was, in theory, a settlement between the Meridian Compact and the Seven World Federation, known informally as the Veth'raan Accord. In practice, it was a ritual of competitive grandeur, each delegation arriving with the most staff, the most ornate credentials, the longest procedural preambles, and the Veth'raan were very, very good at it. They were avian, the Veth'raan, tall, narrow-chested, with layered plumage that shifted between blue-black and deep amber depending on the light, and they moved with the exact unhurried precision of creatures who had never in their evolutionary history needed to hurry. Their senior delegate, a figure called the Third Arbiter, wore ceremonial vestments that took 2 assistants to arrange and took up roughly the same floor area as a small vehicle. I was not, to put it gently, on their radar. I sat at the far end of the human table, behind the senior staff, my paper notepad and my pressed blazer. My job was to record proceedings, cross-reference citations, when Attaché Mbeki leaned back and asked me quietly for a clause number, and otherwise not exist in any visible way. This suited me fine. I had 300 pages of background files in my head, and nothing else to do but listen. Veth'raan noticed me on the second morning. I know this because their delegation had a habit, during recesses, of continuing conversation in their own tongue, the Aleth dialect, which is technically classified as a restricted language for junior staff without full cultural clearance. I had picked it up during a semester exchange at the Veth'raan Academic Assembly the previous year, which the assignment packet had not mentioned, because the assignment packet mentioned almost nothing. I didn't volunteer this information. I sat at the far end of the table and I took notes. What I gathered over the next 2 days, that I was something of an object of gentle amusement. The Third Arbiter referred to me as the small record keeper, in an aside to his first secretary on the second afternoon. His first secretary made a sound that I can only describe as a suppressed trill, which is the avian equivalent of a stifled laugh. On the 3rd day, during a particularly long procedural recess, 2 of the junior Veth'raan staff had an extended exchange about my notepad, specifically the fact that I was writing by hand. One of them said, in Aleth dialect, that it was charming in the way that antique implements were charming, a complete artifact of a culture that hadn't quite caught up. The other one said that it was perhaps a custom, the way certain Earth peoples maintained ceremonial traditions, long past any practical necessity. First one agreed. They decided jointly that I was probably participating in some kind of ritual. I wrote all of this down. On the 4th day, Conclave broke. It broke the way these things always break, not in fire but in procedure. The Veth'raan delegation submitted a formal challenge to the Trade Framework's arbitration clause, specifically Section 14, subsection 7, governed how disputes arising from the treaty's provisions would be escalated. Their position was that subsection 7 had been drafted ambiguously, and that, under a strict reading, any dispute could be routed to the Veth'raan Internal Tribunal rather than the Joint Review Board. This was not a small thing. It would have made the entire compact effectively unenforceable from the human side. 40 senior human diplomats sat very still for a moment. Then they began to talk, and they kept talking, and after 2 hours of talking, the only consensus was that this would require a legal review, which would take weeks, which effectively killed the summit. Attaché Mbeki leaned back very slightly and said nothing. She had the face of someone doing the math on a career. The third arbiter was patient about it. He folded his vestments with the unhurried precision of someone who had expected this outcome, and had no strong feelings either way. He said, in the formal register of Aleth, that the accord would of course await the review with all appropriate courtesy. I raised my hand. This was told later, not procedurally normal. Junior staff did not raise hands in session. Ache Mbeki looked at me with the kind of attention that carries both alarm and a slight, careful opening. I said, still in the formal register, respect to the third arbiter. The ambiguity in Section 14, Subsection 7 was addressed in the Accord's own founding supplementary protocol. The Veth'raan Amendment, ratified in the second cycle of the Joint Assembly, establishes that arbitration clause disputes default to the Joint Review Board pending any formal reclassification by a 2/3 vote of all member worlds. The amendment is appended as Annex C to the Accord's foundational charter. There was a silence of specific quality, the kind that happens when a room recalibrates. The third arbiter's first secretary opened his terminal. He searched. He found Annex C. He read it. The third arbiter looked at me for a long moment. His plumage shifted. A slow pull from amber toward something cooler. A color I'd learned during my exchange year was associated with the particular experience of having said something in a room that turned out to contain more walls than anticipated. He asked, in Aleth dialect, not the formal register now, but the direct conversational register, is used between people who have stopped pretending, how long I had spoken the language. I told him, about 14 months. I said the exchange program had been very thorough. He was quiet for another moment. Then he asked about the notepad. I told him I found it easier to annotate cross-references in the margins. Tablets tended to bury footnotes. His plumage did another slow shift. His first secretary had the expression of someone who would be having a different kind of conversation at the end of the day. The third arbiter indicated, with a small inclination of his head, that the challenge to subsection 7 would be formally withdrawn pending internal review of Annex C. He said this in the formal register to the room without any additional remark. The summit resumed the following morning and concluded on schedule. On the way back to the transport, Attaché Mbeki walked beside me for a moment. She didn't say much. She looked at my notepad. Then she said that perhaps the tablet allocation could be revisited after all, if I wanted one. Told her the notepad was fine. She nodded once the way people do when they've decided something, and walked ahead. The accord was signed 6 weeks later. I was not in the room for that. Junior staff again, different assignment by then. But Mbeki sent a message, said, Annex C held, that was all, I kept the notepad.